This year, the U.S. military will have its smallest active duty force since 1940. The U.S. military fell short of its recruiting goals for the Army, Navy, and Air Force. The Army missed its goal by 10,000 soldiers, as did the Air Force. The Navy was 6,000 short. The Marine Corps and Space Force, thankfully, were among the five service branches, were the two of the five service branches that actually met their recruiting goals. The Defense Department estimates, and listen to this, that only 23% of Americans aged 17 to 24 would qualify for military service, and the rest would be rejected for being overweight, abusing drugs, or having mental and physical health problems. But it's more than that. Our younger generation is full of people who feel entitled, who question the very promise of this nation, who don't understand the importance of service, not even community service. And of course, there's the wokeness in the military, or at least the perception of it. There's lots of back and forth on this topic. We've heard Biden telling Air Force airmen that the greatest threat facing America was global warming. We've seen CRT, critical race theory, in our service academies. There's been discussions about making titles gender neutral. To be sure, the military has pushed back, or at least its leadership, on this narrative, saying that they're not woke. But their argument seems spurious. Most importantly, there is absolutely a perception that the US military has gone woke. Interestingly, this is not just a phenomenon in the United States. UK military recruitment is currently experiencing a significant decline as well, with data showing that more people are leaving the armed forces in the UK than are joining, creating recruitment crises across all branches, including the Navy, the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, and the British Army. And in a time with increased acts of terrorism on our streets, attacks on the West seen daily in capitals all over the West, military enrollment should be up. But the world is losing its mind. And it's not just the younger generation, it's our institutions here in the US and abroad. And while the majority of American voters overwhelmingly rejected these woke ideologies, we have not rid ourselves of woke institutions and media. This week, the focus is on the International Criminal Court, which the US and Israel are both not members of. The ICC issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. The allegations are that they committed the war crime of starvation as a method of warfare, crimes against humanity of murder, persecution, and other inhumane acts, and the war crime of intentionally directing an attack against the civilian populations. The charges are as ridiculous as they are baseless. Israel is not a member of the ICC. Israel has an independent and robust legal system to adjudicate any claims. There's no evidence that Israel is committing war crimes by intentionally targeting civilians or using starvation as a tool of war. In fact, the opposite is true. All reliable evidence points to Israel's extraordinary efforts to avoid civilian casualties and to provide as much food as needed to the people of Gaza. Moreover, it's known beyond any reasonable doubt that Hamas is operating from within civilian infrastructures, using civilians as human shields in contravention with international law. Hamas continues to steal most of the aid that comes into Gaza, using it as a tool of repression against its own people. And it's worth noting that the Palestinians managed to be admitted to the ICC as a member, quote unquote, state in 2015. This comes despite the fact that there is no such thing as a Palestinian state. There is no state of Palestine. And the PA, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are all dictatorial terrorist entities that should be given no shelter in international institutions, such as the ICC. In fact, to become a member of the ICC, the country must ratify the Rome Statute, the court's founding treaty. This is laughable for the Palestinians for various reasons, including that the statute reaffirms in its preamble that all states shall refrain from threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any other state. Remember October 7th? But here we are. This is Standpoint. I'm Gabe Groisman. And here to talk with us this morning is my friend, Colonel Richard Kemp. Colonel Kemp has spent most of his life fighting terrorism and insurgency, commanding British troops on the front lines of some of the world's toughest hotspots, including Afghanistan, Iraq, the Balkans, and Northern Ireland. He's now a writer, a prolific journalist, a media commentator, and motivational speaker. He provides strategic consultancy services on leadership, security, intelligence, counterterrorism, and defense. Colonel Kemp was sent to Kabul in 2003 to take command of British forces in Afghanistan, where he led a counterinsurgency force by putting together a fighting force made up of British troops and U.S. Marines. He's also been in Israel on the ground with the IDF, observing the war over the past year and brings some amazing insights. Colonel Richard Kemp, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, Gabe.
Thanks so much for everything you're doing, by the way. I mean, you're one of the most sought after speakers when it comes to military strategies, what's happening all over the world, including, but not limited to, what's been happening in Israel. But let's start about the ICC. That's the big news story this week. You heard me sort of break down a little bit of what the charges are there. As someone who's commanded troops all over the world and has seen the IDF firsthand, what do you make of the charges?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely shocking. It's one of the most significant political warfare attacks against Israel, probably the most significant attack since this war began. And it's not just an attack against Israel, it's an attack against the Western world, it's an attack against the United States and all democratic armies. Because what it says effectively is if you defend yourself against jihadist attack, then you're going to be dragged into the Hague, in the dock in the Hague, you're going to be branded a war criminal. And that's a deterrent to any armed force, any country that needs to defend itself against jihadism. Israel didn't start this war. Hamas started the war. Israel has carried out very reasonable defense of its people on 7 different battlefronts, including in Gaza, which is the main focus for the ICC's efforts. And as you quite rightly said, the ICC has no jurisdiction here. The ICC's charter prevents it from carrying out legal action against a country which has the capability, and indeed in Israel's case, the track record of doing that for itself. It's a court of last resort. It's not a court to use for effectively this political purpose of vilifying Israel, which is what's happening. And the other reasons you mentioned as well, why there is no jurisdiction, including the fact that the Palestinians, the state of Palestine does not actually exist. It's been unilaterally declared to be a state by the ICC, who've also determined its boundaries, a subject that's been under discussion for decades, yet the ICC suddenly decided they can do it. And then, of course, there is the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords, whether you like them or don't like them, they're an international treaty that remains extant, yet the ICC has ridden roughshod over the Oslo Accords because the ICC's charter only allows it to accept jurisdiction over a country if that's delegated by another country, in this case, the fictional state of Palestine. Yet the state of Palestine, so-called, agreed in the Oslo Accords that it would not have any criminal jurisdiction over Israeli citizens, so it can't delegate that authority. There are numerous other reasons why this is a distortion of justice, not including, of course, what you also mentioned quite rightly, that Israel's done everything it can to operate within the laws of war, minimizing the deaths of innocent civilians, while Hamas is trying to maximize the deaths of their own civilians in order to vilify Israel, and at the same time making sure that more than 1 million tons of aid has got into Gaza, which is in itself, it's a historic, unprecedented phenomenon for a country to facilitate aid delivery to its enemy civilian population while it's fighting in the same terrain. So everything the ICC is trying to do from a jurisdictional standpoint and from the point of view of evidence can only be viewed as a political warfare against Israel.
You know, the ICC, the documents that underlie these arrest warrants are private, which is what's interesting, because Karim Khan, the prosecutor there, selectively put together a press release and selected whatever facts he wanted to put out there, leaving just breadcrumbs for people to gather and try to understand what basis they had. It seems like the factual basis for this is based entirely on news reports, et cetera, third-party accounts, no actual evidence, because we know the evidence isn't there. But Colonel Kemp, you were on the ground there. Can you describe a little bit what you saw, your experience there? First of all, how the IDF let you in to get those. I understand you had some briefings with leadership there, and you got to see the troops operating. What did you see on the ground there?
Yeah, I've been into Gaza with the IDF several times since the war began. including with two separate groups of retired NATO generals who were also there to examine the war, each over a period of a week. And all of us concluded there were a total of, they were talking about a total of about 30 people here, all generals with battle experience, who, and they concluded the same thing I concluded, which is that the IDF have been operating entirely within the laws of armed conflict. Yes, of course, there have been war crimes committed. Every army, in every conflict, there are war crimes because soldiers do the wrong thing. You get bad soldiers in the IDF just as well as you get bad soldiers in every army. So there are individual cases, I have no doubt, where civilians have been killed when they shouldn't have been killed. But it's not a matter of policy, it's the opposite of policy. And the IDF, as the British and the American army, when these allegations are made against their soldiers, or when they discover that their soldiers have acted against the law, then they deal with it. They take disciplinary action and they court-martial them when appropriate. But the reality inside Gaza is that IDF soldiers and commanders from the top level downwards, they do everything they can to eliminate Hamas, to kill Hamas terrorists, to destroy their weaponry, while at the same time doing everything they can to minimize the deaths of innocent civilians. And that's included dropping more than a million leaflets, several million leaflets onto the population of Gaza, warning them of strikes, telling them where to go, telling them where is going to be safer, what routes to take to get there. They've sent millions of voice messages, text messages, phone calls, other forms of communication with the civilian population to get them to move. And I was actually at a command group meeting inside Gaza of IDF generals who were planning a significant operation. And they spent about half of the total time for that operational planning meeting figuring out how best to carry out the attack to destroy Hamas while reducing the prospects of killing civilians who were sheltering in a nearby refugee center. And they succeeded in that. They came up with some innovative methods and succeeded. Now, none of that supports any allegation by Karim Khan or anyone else that the IDF is deliberately trying to kill civilians. Quite the opposite. I've also been to aid checkpoints. The IDF has opened two brand new aid crossing points into Gaza from Israel. They've built roads inside Gaza for the specific purpose of getting aid distributed inside Gaza. They've facilitated, as I said, more than 1 million tons of aid into Gaza. More aid has gone into Gaza since this war began than in an equivalent period before the war. There is no indication of starvation inside Gaza, which has been alleged by the ICC. There is a problem with distribution of aid, and that problem comes from two sources, not from the IDF. It comes, first of all, from the United Nations' inability, because of their lack of resources, to deliver aid, and that's their own responsibility. It's not because of anything Israel's done. And secondly, vast quantities of aid are hijacked by Hamas and other gangsters inside Gaza for their own purposes. Hamas warehouses are full, or were full, of humanitarian aid. That which they don't need themselves, they then sell at a premium. Aid that's been donated freely by your tax dollars and my tax pounds have been sold by Hamas to people that are in need. So this is the real situation inside Gaza. I've seen it all with my own eyes. And the generals that I was with, that I mentioned before, they have attested exactly the same thing. These are people who've got decade upon decade of combat experience between them.
Yeah, the interesting thing that we're going to see now is how the West, really, it's really the West versus everyone else, but how the West responds to these ICC arrest warrants. The ICC doesn't have a police force. For those who don't know, the member states have to execute, or are supposed to execute, the warrants themselves if someone with an arrest warrant enters their jurisdiction. So we're seeing different leaders take different stands on this. We've had Justin Trudeau from Canada, our friend up north here, saying that he would arrest Netanyahu or Gallant if they came into Canada. And not to put you on the spot for your country, but just today, UK Foreign Secretary said that he would do the same. He said, just to quote him directly, "We are signatories to the Rome Statute, and we have always been committed to our obligations under international law. and international humanitarian law. He goes on to say, but of course there would be due process and they'd be taken to a court for a hearing, etc., saying that they would actually arrest the Prime Minister of Israel if he were to step foot in England. What's happening in the UK?
Yeah, well, that I think that statement shows David Lammy's ignorance of his obligations under the Rome Statute, which founded the International Criminal Court, because his country, my country, is not obliged to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, or anyone else who's had an arrest warrant issued for them. What they are obliged to do, they're obliged to satisfy themselves that the legal basis for the arrest warrants and the jurisdiction of the ICC is valid. They have to satisfy themselves of that before they can make any arrests or take these accused individuals through legal process in the UK. They've got to do that, and they haven't done it. They won't do it because it actually suits their political purposes to go along with the ICC, and that goes for Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada as well. He's not under an obligation, as he has suggested he is, to execute these arrest warrants. And in fact, he's under a moral obligation as well as a legal one, not to do so. And I think there is a bit of a conflict here with both Canada and the UK and the United States. President Biden has rejected, his administration has rejected the ICC's arrest warrants. Yet, I mean, I'm not kind of praising President Biden unreservedly on this. He's quite right to do that. But actually, he should have stopped it happening in the first place. The world superpower has the capability, has the influence and the authority to prevent these arrest warrants from happening. I believe that the Biden administration actually gave a green light to the ICC, added the European powers to go forward with these arrest warrants. And that's shameful. And my hope and expectation is that President Trump, when he comes into office, will reverse all of that, will not just reject the ICC's arrest warrant decision, but actually reimpose the sanctions on the ICC that he put in place when he was president before. And I think President Trump should use his international authority to destroy the International Criminal Court, to take it apart. It's something that threatens not just Israel, but the whole of the world, including Western security, including US national security interests. And it needs to be taken apart. It can't be allowed to continue in this way, carrying out its campaign of political warfare against Israel.
Yeah, I mean, if the purpose for which it was created in 2002, I think it was created in 2001 and started operating in 2002, which was to be a court of last resort for the world's worst violators of laws of war and inhumanity and genocide, etc. They obviously have not met that, and they've turned the court into a kangaroo court, a political kangaroo court, to go after their enemies, and that's clearly the case. Whether Biden gave the green light right now or he didn't, we'll find out, I'm sure, with some time. But one thing he did do was rescind President Trump's, when he was president last time, executive order putting sanctions on the ICC. The purpose of those sanctions were because the ICC was threatening to investigate the United States for its actions in Afghanistan, and the United States issued these sanctions under President Trump's executive order, which was rescinded by President Biden, because he did rescinded, if not all, most of the executive orders that were put in place. Definitely not all. I know a few that were left in place almost by accident, probably. But so that is definitely a tacit green light. Whether there was an explicit one, time will absolutely tell. Luckily, today, President Trump announced tariffs, 25% tariffs for our neighbors to the south and to the north here, Mexico and Canada, if they don't seal the border, giving them a little bit of a head start, 55-day head start to seal the border with their militaries, or the tariffs will be in place. And maybe we'll see something similar like that to create pressure for our allies, the United States allies in Europe, et cetera, to really put pressure as members of the ICC beyond just the sanctions, which we know are coming back in less than 2 months on the ICC. Let's move over, though, Colonel Kemp, to what we started the show with. And we spoke about this a little last night. We were able to share some bread last night, or more specifically, some steaks. We're speaking a little bit about what's happening in militaries around the world, in the Western world, the UK and the US in particular. This morning, I spent some time digging up the numbers. Of course, they supported everything we were talking about last night about how enlistment numbers are just sharply down in the US and the United Kingdom alike. What do you attribute that to?
Yeah, well, one of the things I attribute that to, it may not be the overriding or most significant thing, but one of the things is exactly what we've just been talking about, the International Criminal Court. And thinking more about the UK than necessarily the US, although the same may well apply in the US. The UK has had a series of legal attacks against soldiers who have been fighting in Northern Ireland decades ago, in Afghanistan and Iraq, for allegations of breaking the law. In the case of Afghanistan and Iraq, of allegations of war crimes. And many of those investigations are still going on. Now, it's absolutely right that a country should investigate alleged war crimes. But what we've had in the UK is a situation where allegations against soldiers in Northern Ireland half a century ago are being dragged up again for political purposes, when investigations took place at the time and the soldiers were cleared. Now you're getting old age pensioners dragged into court to answer charges from, as I say, half a century ago. Now, if you combine that kind of action, which has been tainting Great Britain for a long time, with the International Criminal Court's well-publicized action, who wants to join the army if you're going to you're going to be ordered into battle to fight, and then you're going to be dragged into court, you'll be branded a criminal. So that is one factor. There are many other factors, probably more significant factors than that as well. And in Britain, I think you mentioned it in relation to the United States, that at least the perception of wokeness of the armed forces, which I think has a great deal of validity as well as just being perception. It's infected armed forces throughout the Western world. And the big problem with it is that those people who want to join the army, these are not the people or the armed forces, these are not the people who are influenced by wokeness. They don't want to be woke. These are not the kind of people they want to stand up and fight for their own country. And the kind of people that do support woke ideas, they don't want to join the army. So it's totally counterproductive to have we have recruitment policies which highlight the woke ideology that persists in elements of the British Armed Forces today. So that's another reason. And on top of that, you then have, in Britain certainly, and I'm sure the same is true in the US, you've got very large numbers of immigrants into the country, whether legal or illegal, who now make up a significant element of the population. Some of them join the armed forces, and I've served myself with many very, very good soldiers who didn't originate from the UK, but nevertheless had an allegiance and loyalty to the UK. But I would say in a very large number of cases, that is not going to be the case. What is the purpose of joining the armed forces? You join the armed forces voluntarily to a large extent because you want to stand up and fight for your country and the values of your country. If you don't share those values because you come from somewhere completely different, then there is less incentive, I think, in many cases to do so. On top of that, in the British forces, we have, the British Armed Forces have been run down, as you alluded to the US as well, been run down over many years now. It's got smaller and smaller and smaller since the Cold War, in numbers, in quantity of hardware, etc. And the current government, the current Labour government in Britain, is already planning and has announced even more defence cuts, even as the war in Ukraine rages on and the threat from global jihadism from Iran, the potential threat from China, the actual threat from Russia increases. So we've been cutting our forces. Now, again, what's the message there? Does a young man or woman who's thinking of joining the army or the Navy or the Air Force, do they want to join something that's constantly being cut? They want to probably join a growth industry that has a long-term future for them. That's not the case in either of our armed forces at the moment. I hope it changes. And then, one other issue to do with the UK, I think, which is probably more unique to the UK, is we have a completely dysfunctional recruiting system. I won't bore you with the details of that, but the reason we have such a terrible outsourced, civilianized recruiting system for the armed forces is, again, to save money, because successive governments have been unwilling to invest the resources they need into the armed forces.
I think what's really telling both here and in the UK is if you read up on this issue, and I'm pretty sure it was an FDD, a Foundation for Defense of Democracy's article that they put out, or piece essay that they put out on this, which is that historically, and it also just makes sense logically, when there's economic instability, enlistment goes up because it's you have a sense of purpose, you get a job, you get a paycheck, you get a career, you get up. It's sort of a power up in life. It's been, at least historically, joining the military, but we're not seeing that at all these days. The second piece I think that's interesting to think about is when we've seen the U.S. move so many military assets and its allies as well to the region. You know, when our enemies don't react to seeing naval fleets on the shores of their waters, and they still continue to attack our allies in a way that really shows a disrespect to the U.S. military, if you ask me. And of course, it says more about the leadership, the political leadership, than the soldiers. So it says only something about the political leadership and its unwillingness to use the military. But it also must have an effect on soldiers and on potential recruits, right? When the opposite is true, when you move military assets to a region and things change immediately, that's something that young men and women want to be a part of, right? It pushes people to want to be patriots, want to serve, want to be part of something bigger than themselves. No one wants to just be a political pawn to move here to say they move something, but it not actually yield any results. But we're almost running out of time, so I do want to ask you one last question. You served in Afghanistan. As you know, President Biden had a disastrous pullout from Afghanistan. According to all of those of us on the conservative side in the United States, is probably the darkest day in American history, if not the darkest day for sure in the last 4 years. You know, what's your perspective on how the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan, having served there for so many years?
Yeah, I served in Afghanistan, and with some extraordinary American force as well, Marines, Army, Air Force, and even Navy, despite the fact there's no sea in Afghanistan. And I was very, very proud, really, to be serving with British forces, but also alongside American forces. I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a betrayal of those armed forces that had fought there for all that time. There were significant achievements there. Let's not forget the reason we went in the first place was to prevent Afghanistan from again becoming a launch base for a 9/11 style attack or anything similar to it. And that succeeded over the years. There were many problems with the Afghanistan campaign, but that there was never a major international terrorist attack launched from there before the withdrawal. There have been since the withdrawal, including relatively recent attack in Moscow. But beyond, you know, apart from the betrayal of the armed forces that sacrificed and fought so bravely in Afghanistan, it was a betrayal of the Afghan people who had begun to get a better life under the new regime, the non-Taliban regime in Afghanistan. That's all been put right back to the situation they were in before 2001. So a betrayal of them. But on an even wider scale, this attack showed American weakness. It showed the weakness of the Biden administration. And I believe it incited Putin to invade Ukraine. He saw how weak Biden was, and he decided to make a run into Ukraine. He hadn't done that under the Trump administration. He had done it under the Obama administration in 2014, but he hadn't done it under Trump. He did it under Biden. And I also think, and so it's, you know, it shows how a lack of deterrence actually encourages dictatorships like Putin to do what they think they want to do. And I also believe that the same applies to 7th of October and the Seven Front War that's been going on since then. That wouldn't have happened, in my view. Iran would not have had the courage to direct these events unless Biden had been in the White House. Biden's weakness showed that. I think if President Trump had been there, we probably would not have seen the 7th of October. And now I think is the time, or in the coming months, is the time to make restitution for that. And
yeah, we're all very excited for January 20th to come and see how our fortunes change in the region.
Yeah.
Colonel Richard Kemp, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody, make sure to like, subscribe, and share, and do all the great things you do to support podcasts. And we'll see you next time.